I read The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, and in the book, they made all these characters and they go through all these series, and I stopped reading it, and I started picking up other books, like that Dragon series. And all these books kind of have something in common where they're going into some sort of bridge or some sort of wardrobe. But then I started reading some other things, and more literature, Russian literature, and then reading different spiritual texts, looking at all the philosophers. I loved looking at all of the different ways they looked about things, and everything kind of made sense, so I stuck it into my wardrobe. And then I was thinking about how we go through conversations, and conversations take us to other conversations, and then that's kind of how we do life. But at the same time, we have everything in our wardrobe, and in our wardrobe is really what's guiding all of these conversations. Same thing with music. I got music in my wardrobe, and so I'm able to listen to that and kind of be reflective and sort of what the big picture looks like. And the big picture is also a conversation where you're going through life and you're like, okay, well, big picture is I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and everything works out. And it always does work out. And so that's part of the big picture and part of the big conversation, and part of the books too is you read the books, you listen to music, and everything comes together in your conversation with life. And that's really what inspires you or decides, how you're feeling that day. You wake up in a good conversation, or I guess in a good sleep after a good dream. And the conversation there, you wake up with that, and maybe your mind is empty and your day is, maybe you have a day off and you decide you're gonna go to the beach, you're gonna go hiking or something. And so whatever the conversation is at that point is gonna be what guides that particular day. If it's your day off, or if you're going to work, then it's the conversations you have at work. But we don't like to get repetitive either. We like something different, a token out of our wardrobe. And so we're stacking all these tokens, and eventually we get through the mazes of the mystery of what was in those wardrobes. And I think that's where the books come out of. Those kind of books is once you start stacking all these tokens, you start to see, well, there's a little bit more art in everything. There's a little more of a story behind everything. And when you can kind of look at it through your own eyes and with whatever colors are inspiring that picture, then you come away with a story in and of itself with your own interpretation. And that may be a award-winning series, or it may just be a great conversation that you're having. So a lot of that is really fun, and so you just try to stay in that conversation. But at the same time, if you're out at sea, the conversation at sea is pretty interesting. I think that's something that if you find yourself out at sea, and then first thing I ask myself is, well, do you even want to be out at sea? Is that even where you want to be stuck in the first place? And so a lot of people who go out to sea aren't really looking at getting stuck out at sea, so it's kind of its own conversation before you even go out to sea. And that's really what, a lot of it is before you do something, you kind of know the big conversation, you kind of know the big picture of where that might lead you. And so that wardrobe is interesting because you may not know where you're going to go in life, but at the same time, you kind of do. And so with all of those different experiences or conversations, then you come away with these different memories or tokens, I would say, more so than the memories, that we can stow away in our wardrobe. And then, if we're sitting down somewhere for a reflection and then something reminds us of something else, a lot of that has to do with how we stocked those tokens in the first place. And so then the music that comes out of the jukebox just depends on, how those tokens were, which slots they were put into. And so life is not really a gamble, there's not really any risk. And so if you're going out and having a conversation, the gamble or the risk is not really, something that you think about. It's just something that is something also that you ride. So if you're looking at a wave or if you're out sailing, then you're not going to do something risky because that would not be good. And so when we're looking at risk, normally we're not making risks. And when we're looking at gambling, we're not usually gambling. And so we're always looking at sure things. We're always looking at the complete conversation before we have a conversation. And so that's really also the part of that big picture. And reading those books and reading all of those different texts give us, I think, a wider landscape to draw from as far as those conversations, or what sort of surfaces that we bounce off of first before we go into others, and then also kind of the imagery too that dictates where we are in that conversation. And that's always can be all sorts of ways. You can go hiking and talk about nothing, or you can go hiking and talk about what is around the hike. And sometimes it's not even about that, and it's just more about the conversation that is inspiring from above. And so I think that that's really the main perspective, is how do you sit and how do you place yourself to be in the right place or at the right time to have a conversation, or for that conversation to fall from above to be something that's super super interesting. And usually if you sit down and talk to somebody, you always have something interesting. There's always something cool to talk about, and I think that's really the main aspect of life, is not so much anything other than that. If you sit down and you have a conversation, what's that conversation? What does that kind of look like? And how does that, illustrate not just your passage through life or through conversation, but how does it stow away in your wardrobe? And how is it, something that makes you excited? So it's nice when you don't really have to think about it and everything kind of just flows naturally. But then you're always looking at where are you going back to, or where are you going between. And so if everything is consolidated in the same place, then you're never really leaving that place, and you're always going and staying in that place. So it's not really a matter of going back to something or switching between things, but looking at all these different cohorts, or all these different if you look at, what did I say, like conversations, you could have the same conversation, you could have kind of your style conversation with anybody, but at the same time it usually isn't that way. Usually it's that if you're consolidated, normally your conversations stay in that consolidated place. Normally you're not having conversations outside of that place. So you're not having conversations with people outside of that place. And I think that's nice, and I think that's good, because it keeps everything organized. I think if you go and you leave and you go to sit down somewhere, you kind of want to have conversations that are tokenable, so to speak, or that make something that is consolidated in that sense with whatever it is that is, or that with that whole consolidation or consolidated conversation or a big picture. But it's not even a big picture at that sense. It's more of like it's one version of a big picture. And so I think that's another way of looking at it, is if you read a book, normally the picture is you're looking at it from the beginning to the end, and then you're looking at it from the end back, or maybe from a thematic aspect, or from the culminations of the book. Or maybe you're taking away nuggets along the way. Maybe it's not necessarily a big picture, but something that you just go through and pick up pieces as you read along. But you know, the efficacy of that and the talent of that is really what's going to be, what holds a conversation together. And if it holds the conversation, then usually you're there having that conversation. If it doesn't, usually the conversation wouldn't happen in the first place. And so you're looking at what leads into a conversation, or the pieces that are laying in a conversation. Normally they're not. Normally they're only on certain areas. They're only in certain ways. They're certain, kind of the same stuff that you would lay down. You know. But at the same time, there's all sorts of different artistic influences of the environment, or things that may be in the news that you could talk about. So the conversation doesn't necessarily have to be something that is provoking, but in just that sort of, just to have a conversation. So this is something to kind of turn on different lights in the room or whatever. I think is really the strategy, or the main consolidation. But then again, we are usually in control of that conversation, and we're wondering, maybe, is what's the best conversation to have in terms of, if life is a conversation, what are the best conversations to try to create, or to try to accomplish in our wardrobe, so that our life is more straightforward. If we're going through if we're going to different places, if we're deciding what we're going to do with our day, or with our day off, or whatever it is our big picture is, what would be the conversation that we could always use to make that always the end goal, the immediate end goal. So a lot of people use and that's why I'm looking at YouTube, because a lot of people will use just the social media or the video to kind of have that conversation, or to have more of those pieces come together as a conversation. Oh, well, what do you do? Or what's around? Because what it's good to eat, things like that. So a lot of times it's like, well, I have all of these catering things, or I have all these travel experiences, or I like to do this for my hobbies, or I just look at these goats that I took a picture of, or whatever. But it's all this non-random, and a lot of those things end up being kind of similar. And so what is that full encompassing conversation that kind of brings us to those end goals, where are we looking at planning things out, or are we looking at just showing what we've already done? And usually it's showing what we've already done. So if we're never leaving that place, we want to make sure that we're always doing that thing that we want to show that we got done. And so what's nice about website development, or software development, or artistry, or music, is that you can just pull that up and say, oh, this is some stuff that I got done. Check out, and it's super cool to share. And it kind of expands the conversation. But in my experiences, the conversation began with the books before it came about. Because I would have travel experiences also and all those things, but it's all kind of more of a self-absorbed way of sharing things, which is fine. But I think it's better in the youth than it is when you get older. And so looking at how the books kind of evolved into, okay, well, it's fun to talk about, draw from those different things, but ultimately I think that to be able to have a conversation about work that is exciting, that's really the conversation that you kind of grow into, I think, after it starts with the books of like, where do our conversations begin? Why do they begin? What kind of conversations begin? And then the books kind of tell us a bit about that. And then we grow, and then we evolve those conversations into the work that we do. And then the work that we do ends up being, well, it's just, and then the conversations end up being, a lot more multi-layered, or not even that, but multi-leveled, I think, where you could go to this floor, you can go to this floor, you can go to this room, you can go to that room, you can go next door, because you own the whole state, as when it comes to that particular conversation. And so that's really what it comes down to, I think, is you want to sit down, you want to have a conversation, but you want to have a conversation that's kind of expert conversation. You know how irritating it is when you hear something that somebody has no idea what they're talking about, and it's like, well, why am I listening to that? There's no reason to listen to that. And so you're always wanting to listen to the experts, and the experts are always the ones that are going to be there in the first place, because they're the ones doing their job, or they're there on their day off, or they're there, talking about what they do for work, or maybe they're just having a conversation, but they're drawing from the wardrobe that they accumulated through that particular expertise that you could call the whole life, or beginning with the books, and then the books end up becoming the expertise of that person's conversation. So, looking at a social platform where, it's not that interesting to look through Facebook, but it is interesting to look through interviews. And so I have this interview platform where I created an interview box, and then you can expand the box, and there's all sorts of notes and details and attributes and more, like picture attachments and things like that. And then you can kind of go through, and it links together units, and basically shows you how one, and then it goes into other interviews too. So, and it kind of is a planning board for what to do with that interview. And so I'm jumping back on YouTube as a way of kind of promoting that way of networking, because you can also include PDFs, and you can also include all those things where it's right in the same window, and you're not necessarily having to do any uploading, and you're not have to spending any money, and it's all private. And so looking at, sitting down, and someone is like, well, or if you have an interview, if you're meeting up with somebody and you want to have an impromptu interview or whatever, and you want to be able to kind of map out what that interview is for, or what those conversations are about, or if you want to collaborate on anything, or just to have your own gallery or code hanger, or if you want to have a place to plan out, or even just to write it in there, and then you can use that as your main notepad, and then you can save the pieces out of that to create and compile whatever it is that you want to do. So what's nice is to be able to see that in these different interviews, so that you can kind of see how everything consolidates under what topics, and it's a lot more interesting if you're looking at, well, if somebody wants to check out your music, or if someone wants to check out your YouTube or whatever, it's kind of nice to be able to see it sequenced like that. You could always be like, oh, check out my website. And so what's great about this platform is it's just kind of one of those pieces where it's just like, yeah, check out my website, or as opposed to check out my video, because the videos will already be in there. So that's what's nice about it. But looking at the conversations of what leads to what, and how do we, the big picture of what is the conversation that is to maneuver through, so that you're always in the right place at the right time, and then you're always having the conversations you want to be having. I think starting with an interview sets up the conversations after the interview, and then maybe there's an interview after that, so, or maybe not, but what's cool about this approach is it's social media or a social platform, or it's just a conversation under this interview setting, but that you could always be having an interview. If you go and sit down and someone sits next to you and you have a conversation, you could consider that something like an interview. You're interviewing them, they're interviewing you in a sense. Thinking, looking at the expertise in that conversation and what is pulled out and what of that wardrobe and the tokens that are placed or that are created out of that. So all of that, it doesn't have to be videoed, but in this sort of sense of you start with an interview or not, but if you could start with an interview, and then you're starting with looking at how the conversation is mapped out. But not necessarily. You could always have notes. You could be like, well, if I want to write down a place for my notes for my conversations, or if you want to, as opposed to just putting it in your notes on your phone, it's kind of a simple way of you open up a simple little page, and then you add in whatever you want, or you can add in your video, things like that. So it's just a different approach. And then what else? It's cool to be able to kind of share books that you've read, or if you want to look at things like that. So on Facebook you have those kind of sections, but it's not really the view, I think, in my opinion. I'm always really, I always have a kind of my own way of looking at how something should be displayed. So with this approach is you already have your list of books that you've read, or maybe you have quotes that you like and things you want to draw from. But more importantly, it's things that you want others to see about you and that kind of add to the conversation. And maybe you're too lazy to do that. But for me, I'm definitely that lazy also. But I like to add pieces of poetry or things that I like to look back on, or maybe different museum art pieces or different pictures that I've taken. But I like it, not necessarily in albums, but I like it organized in a sort of these packages, or these kind of really easy exportable sections, or kind of things like that. So and then having it under the interviews and having it through the different notepads makes it a lot easier, or alongside the notepads makes it a lot easier to kind of see everything right there in front of you. Especially if you're having a conversation, you need to look at your notes, or if you want to pull up a presentation real quick, it's all right there. So that's what's super nice about that. And then if somebody wanted to take a copy of it, you could always quickly share the whole thing or share a section of it. So that makes it really easy too. But mostly everybody already kind of knows everybody. Everybody usually knows, like, if you're going to have a conversation, usually you already kind of know what that conversation is going to look like, or what you want out of that conversation. And then not only that, usually you're having conversations with only specific people, generally, because that makes sense. You have a conversation with people that you know. So a lot of things end up happening on their own. And so having, I think the only limitation really is how many people do you know. And so that is really up to the conversation. And that's why I was starting with this, with the conversation is, well, what is the conversation that takes you through, that whole sequence where then you know what you need to know, or, going through everything. And I think that really comes down to just the actual plan and the actual big picture, and then the talent. And so it ends up being where you don't really have to do much, because you already know what you're going to talk about and everything makes sense. And so jumping back to YouTube, it's like, well, YouTube is really nice because you can kind of chart, you can kind of say all that, you can kind of show all of that on YouTube. And right then and there, you already have all your subscribers. And so with all your subscribers, it's, pretty much a done deal. So if you go out and, you don't really want to have a conversation, or maybe you do, but it's not set up, maybe you didn't set up the meeting, or maybe you're just out of, maybe looking to create that conversation. The point is, all of that can be independent of whatever it is that you're doing on the YouTube. And so starting with that interview, putting it on YouTube, and then going over to going wherever it is you want to go, and then kind of always looking at the YouTube and saying, okay, look, there's only one way to have a conversation correctly, so to speak. I mean, your way of having a conversation to be able to go through that particular thing, but you don't want to mess yourself up either. And so, a lot of times it ends up being, well, you have to recognize when to have certain conversations or certain people, or even if that's possible. So you're looking at, you set up interviews, you do this and that, but at the same time, it's still always limiting for some reason. Sometimes it isn't, but sometimes it is. And so YouTube is that there's no limit there. So you put it on the YouTube, already your conversation already has scope, and then from there, whatever it is that you create out of your conversation, your interviews, your PDFs, your designs, your animations, whatever it is that you want to market, or whatever it is that your website is, or your music, you start with that interview on YouTube. It kind of already sets up that conversation to be like, well, you can just, always kind of wear that as the first image of your big picture.